Okay, good morning. So on Tuesday, we talked a little bit about segmenting, targeting, positioning, and today we're supposed to talk about new products. And although the chapters are distinct, one of the things that I tried to emphasize on Tuesday is that this is really important and that they're not necessarily individual silos where you can think of this as a linear process in which case you do this at this step, and this at this step, and this at this step. So we're talking about new products, and we talk about that as an aspect of marketing, and because the chapter treats it as somewhat distinct and separate, a lot of times we forget that we've got to go through all these other steps in terms of environmental scanning, in terms of segmenting targets, positioning, and then, or segmenting, targeting, choosing those elements that we want to target to or market to, and then positioning our product so that we make a image in the mind of the consumer. And as part of that discussion on Tuesday, I started talking about some of my own research, which involves not necessarily traditional marketing, but political marketing, which is a course that I teach. And I think we can take lessons from this into this idea of segmenting, targeting, positioning, and we can apply that to the corporate world and some of the things that are things that I talk about in my own research, and corporations can use them. And I'll give you an example of that when I talk about new products with regard to watches and things like that, Tag Heuer in particular. And I was going to wear my tag today as an example of this, and a reason why I actually went and bought a tag when I took my Rolex in to have it serviced, and I forgot to get it out of the safe. So I was talking last time, before I let you all get into groups, because we're experiencing that point in the semester where we've got a little bit of time compression, because you've got group projects coming up, we've got a second exam coming up, and so we have to have a test review today, and so I gave you that time on Tuesday, and we're going to probably go to the full extent of the hour this time, and I apologize for that, but at the end of the hour when I do the test review, again, I'll give you an opportunity to come up. I'll move the table over, and you can put your electronic devices that you want to use to record the test review on the table, and that may help you studying, and then you won't have to listen to the entire video. But I suggested to you that in the world of political marketing, what we see is we look at the political spectrum, and the reason I use this example is that it does provide a nice linear diagram. Although some political scientists argue that the political spectrum is actually curved or a circle, because at these extreme ends, which are communism and fascism, and really communism is an economic system, and fascism, they behave very similarly. And what we actually find about in the United States is a very narrow range of the political spectrum. And then I suggested to you, on the left we have Democrats, and on the right, basically we have Republicans. And I suggested to you that in the last presidential election, for example, Mitt Romney staked his position over here. And I asked you where Barack Obama staked his position. And these are going to be possible test questions for some of you on the exam. There will be things that test positioning, but some of them may actually involve the application of this example. And some of you said you thought Barack Obama positioned himself over here. And I don't think he did. Because if he had positioned himself over here, he would have said things like what? I support social welfare. It's a great idea. We should go back to the Great Society programs of Lyndon Baines Johnson. Right? That's what he would have said. And the healthcare reform that we got would have been totally socialized medicine if he had positioned himself over here. Right? He would have said, what we need in this country is single payer, do away with all the private healthcare insurance companies, and have a system like they have in Great Britain, where it's single payer, and basically we'll put everybody on Medicare. And won't that be great? And that's not what he did. What did he say? We have a mixed system, and by the way, we're fighting a new battle. The Supreme Court is hearing arguments, they heard arguments yesterday, I believe, on the healthcare law, and whether or not a certain provision of it applies. So he allowed for privatization in this, and I think he really snuggled up right here. And then I suggested to you that one of the things that you run a risk in doing, these people over here are never going to vote for Mitt Romney, right? But I asked you what they will do, and one of you came up with the right answer, which is they simply won't vote. They'll simply stay away from the polls on election day because they will be demotivated. Whereas if you position yourself here, like Mitt Romney does, and you just motivate your base to get out to vote, can that swing elections? Absolutely. Not all votes are equal. In presidential elections, what percentage of our population actually vote? About half of those that are eligible in presidential elections vote. If you look at state elections and local elections, it drops off dramatically. I think I told you all that I'm running again. I used to be Vice Mayor in Guthrie, and I'm running for my old seat there in the last city election. So I got the last city election lists, and I'm going through it, trying to figure out who I'm going to target in my campaign, in my advertising, because not every vote counts. Why should I waste postage on people that may not vote, right? So I'm going to go through and I'm going to target those people that I know voted in the last 3 elections. Guthrie is a town of about 12,000, 10 to 12,000, depending on what year the census is and things like that, if we've got any growth. And how many people do you think voted in my ward in the last election? 200 voted. 200 people out of several thousand, right? That's really, really small. And so you can motivate your base, and George Walker Bush did this really effectively. He said, he staked his claim out over here and said, I'm not going to move from that. I'm just going to motivate my voters to get to the polls. And it worked. Why didn't it work for Mitt Romney? He was not as good at motivating them. He wasn't as good at getting people, George W. Bush people loved. Whether you liked his policies or not, he was an amiable person. Mitt Romney was not. He failed to make that connection in the mind of the voter that would motivate them to absolutely get out and vote for them. So when we look at the segments of the political marketplace and we look at these groups that fall under the umbrellas or banners or headlines of Democrat and Republican, what do we see as the marketing segments? Well, the Republicans have 2 big segments. They have fiscal conservatives, right? These are business people, things like the American Automobile Manufacturers Association, and they have religious conservatives. Those are the 2 broad umbrellas. Under these groups, you'll find lots of others, right? You'll find, for example, Pat Robertson's group under the religious conservatives, the moral majority, people like that, Catholics for Life. And under the Democrats, who do you have? Well, you have generally kind of social liberals, right? Labor, organized labor, the AFL-CIO. Who else? Not necessarily fiscal conservatives. Those that are more for a social safety net. Support things like health care. That's who you have under these. Those are the segments of the population. And then identifying these segments and then appealing to them and getting them out to the polls. Now, in political science, there are 3 theories that we talk about. And they can be applied to the political marketplace, and I think they're interesting to think about. We have what's called classical democratic theory, which says that the way government happens in a democracy is by people getting out and voting. And about 50% of the people actually get out and vote. You set up a constitutional structure, you allow for universal suffrage, and you get people out to vote. You might think of this as a non-expensive consumer good in the marketplace. What's a non-expensive consumer good in the marketplace? Candy bars. How many candy bars are there? There's a lot. Walk up and down the aisle. There are different companies, right? We looked at a video on ethics and slavery that's used in manufacturing. So there's, Cadbury, there's Hershey, there's all these different companies that manufacture, lots of little companies now that have entered the market, and you can buy all kinds of candy bars, right? In contrast to classical democratic theory, there's something, the antithesis is called elite theory. And elite theory says that elections come and go, but the economic elites stay the same. There's an old saying in intellectual property law. I used to practice intellectual property law. That's what I did when I was in the corporate world. I was an intellectual property attorney for the American Education Corporation and an executive vice president for them. And I worked on our trademark stuff and our brands, our brand imaging for the company, which is protected by trademark and filed with the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. And elite theory says that it doesn't really matter who's in office because they have access to money and they can get things done. So Disney is a prime example. In copyright law, we say Disney always wins. Mickey Mouse was about to go into the public domain. Copyrights expire. Intellectual property, unlike other types of property, can vanish. And copyrights expire at the end of a certain term. And so Mickey Mouse was about to go into the public domain. Not the Mickey that you all know from Fantasia or the current iterations of him. It was the old Mickey Mouse, the Steamboat Willie. That doesn't look much like Willie. It doesn't look much like Mickey Mouse today. He didn't talk. He kind of squeaked. Wasn't very entertaining by today's standards. But Disney didn't want Mickey to go into the public domain. They lobbied Congress. They got Congress. It's called the Disney Amendment to extend the Copyright Act so that Mickey Mouse was still protected under copyright and Disney didn't. How do you do that? Michael Eisner was the head of Disney at the time. Michael Eisner made how much money that year from Disney in terms of his overall package, his benefit package? $535 million. That's how much he made. Does somebody like that have any problem getting him to see a United States Congressman, representative, or the President of the United States? Probably not, right? So a middle ground would be called pluralistic theory, pluralism. And pluralism says that, yeah, the elite make up a powerful group, but they're just one group. There are other groups that we can find in society that also influence elections and have power. Groups like what? The NAACP. Does the NAACP represent only wealthy black African Americans? No. In fact, historically, they didn't represent wealthy Americans at all. They represented a group that was economically disadvantaged. The AFL-CIO represents workers. And these groups have power. So it's through coalition and compromise that you get election outcomes and you get things done in politics. Now let's think about this in terms of products. What can we learn? What kind of lessons can we learn from this in terms of a product? TAG Heuer wanted to come out with a new line of watches. They wanted to increase their line in the elite watch category. So what did they do? You think they decreased their cost? Their average watch about 10 years ago was $250. What is their average watch today? It's $1,000. That's the average starting point of their watch. It actually increased sales because the positioning in the mind of the consumer went from a nice watch to being what? A luxury item, a status symbol. More like what? More like Rolex. In terms of classical democratic theory, if we apply this kind of analogy to the marketplace, what's the democratic watch in terms of position? It's going to be something more like what? Timex. It takes a licking and keeps on ticking. Anyone can afford it, right? So we can apply these things. So when we think about new products, we have to think about where we're going to position them, how we're going to segment the markets, and where we're going to put them. Why would you want to develop new products? Or to keep market share. Where do you think Coca-Cola is? We'll talk about managing brands and products on Thursday, a week from today. Let's see if I can get the computer to come on. Turn on, yeah. We'll talk about managing brands and product lines again a week from Thursday. And I'm going to give you an assignment that you have a week from today to complete in your groups for your critical thinking challenge for this week. And what I want you to consider is, what do you think are going to be the major product developments in the next 3 to 5 years? And why have some things maybe failed? So I want you to come up with 3 things that you think will be the major product developments or product categories that will be influenced the most. So you can come up with specific products that you think you'll see on the shelves. I can give you an example. What are you going to see more and more of in terms of automobiles? The automobile's been around for a long time. How is it changing? What's one thing that's going to be required within the next 10 years in every automobile? Backup cameras for safety. That's a huge technology shift from the Ford Model T, right? Even from a lot of cars today. So let's think about Coca-Cola. Some marketing scholars say that you need to be coming up with generating at least 25 ideas constantly to keep up with the market. I don't know if you need to do that many, but that's what some people have estimated. You need to constantly be generating 25 ideas. So let's look at just the products that Coca-Cola has had. And think about this. Why is there such a change in the desire for Coca-Cola products? What's happened recently? Health craze, in particular, what's coming out in 2015? What's the USDA going to do? They've got new proposed food guidelines. Think about the ways that the food guidelines have changed and what impacts those have had. Again, this is going back to environmental scanning. When the USDA, a governmental agency, releases these kinds of things, it impacts the market, right? So, all right, here are all the current Coke brands in the United States. What do you see changing in these brands? Why are they developing new brands? What's one of their brands? Have we talked about this before? I think I've actually used this example, Tab. What is Tab?
Gross.
It's gross. You've actually had one? It's an old diet drink that they came out with. And there are some people that are just still loyal to that brand. They love it. They don't advertise it. They're harvesting the brand, basically. But it's died. Why has Tab, in this market, died and other things have replaced it in the diet soft drink sector?
There's so many choices now.
Tab, as you said, is kind of gross, right? What's better? Diet Coke was a hell of a lot better than Tab. It had it's still got that bitter kind of aftertaste. I actually have gotten to the point where I've drank Diet Coke for so long that I don't like regular Coke, and I don't even like Coke Zero because it's too sweet, in my opinion. And so I like Diet Coke. I'm firmly committed to Diet Coke. But a lot of people, that's a big turnoff, that bitter aftertaste that you get from artificial sweetener. And so what has happened in this market that has led to a new idea in terms of what we can do to come up with a different diet drink. Splenda, yeah. They've taken sugar and refined it and got sugar alcohols that taste a lot more like natural sugar than artificial sugar, than the artificial sweeteners used to. How many of you have used Splenda for something like baking? If you use it in a cake, anybody used it in a cake? Could you tell the difference? It's one of those things that in baking and things like that, it's almost exactly the same as sugar. It's really, really hard to tell the difference. The only way you can tell the difference in things like coffee is it's got slightly, I think, a different texture and things like that than sugar does. It's not quite as sweet. So the USDA has released their guidelines. If we went back to the 1950s, in the 1950s, they said eggs were the perfect breakfast protein. Eggs and black coffee. Why was it considered the perfect breakfast protein? Why was this a great breakfast choice? It's simple. Eggs do have an extraordinary amount of protein in them, which is brain food. And black coffee, caffeine gives you what? It gives you some energy, and if you don't have any sugar or cream in it, it's got what? No calories. What happened in the 1970s and 80s with eggs and coffee? They started to say eggs are what? An enormous source of cholesterol. They're more dangerous than bullets. Avoid them at all costs. And black coffee and caffeine can cause hypertension and high blood pressure. You're just taking your life in your own hands. You might as well give your 3-year-old the 357. What are they saying now? The latest USDA guidelines is what? That they're proposing. Eggs are the ideal protein, and coffee and caffeine are a great thing. In fact, coffee and caffeine have been shown to do what? Moderate amounts of coffee and caffeine. And what they say in the latest proposed guidelines, moderate amounts of coffee are 5 cups a day. That's a moderate amount of caffeine. It can lead to, it's been shown to lead to decreases in Alzheimer's, high blood pressure. These changes in the environment impact the way we market, right? So what has happened with Coca-Cola? I think Coca-Cola as a brand, the beginning part of Coca-Cola said 100 years young. Where do you think Coca-Cola is in the product life cycle? Do you think it's at the mature or declining phase of the product life cycle? I think in the United States, it's in the declining phase. What's on the rise, and this is the reason why Coca-Cola is coming up with all these new types of things. Look at what they've got. Bottled water. Who would have thought 20 years ago that you'd pay more for bottled water than you pay for gas? Get it out of the tap. But it's become a huge industry as you all have become more health conscious and want to drink less sugar water and less of these things which may cause cancer. What is Diet Coke? The aspartame in Diet Coke been shown to cause? It's been shown to cause cancer in lab rats. Now, the amount that you have to have in order to do that in a lab rat is what? It's an extreme amount. So I don't know. But I think these are things, so you've got to constantly be coming up with new ideas, thinking about which segments you're going to choose, how you're going to target them, and then position your products. So, where can we come up with these ideas? I've given you a clue. The USDA and governmental regulations in an environmental scan are going to impact what people think. Should they? Obviously, if we think about this from a rational perspective. 1950s, eggs and coffee, great. 1980s, poison, deadly, will kill you. And we're back to what? It's great. Or if not great, it's at least good. Eggs are a great source of protein. They help your mind, engage. On Tuesday, when you come to class, How many of you actually eat breakfast? You should eat breakfast on Tuesday. Why? You're more mentally alert. You should have some protein. It will help you actually do better on exams. It helps with memory. So have a good breakfast on Tuesday before you come and take the second exam. Having said that, what are you going to have? Eggs and coffee. Perception is important in marketing because individuals' perception is reality, and we rely on people like the government and experts to tell us what is healthy and what's not. I'm not sure that that trust is not misplaced, by the way, if we look at these sort of swings in the guidelines. So this environmental scan, regulations. Cars are having to change as a result of regulations. The products that we have. If you had similar advances in terms of technology and price decreases in the automobile industry, what should an automobile cost today? Not much. Price Pritchett, who does product innovation, suggests that if you had similar decreases in price and increases in technology, the average car today should run on very little gas. It should be highly computerized, and it should cost around $500. What is the average? Because think about this. When my mother bought her first computer for her first business in the 1980s, what do you think she paid for that computer? She paid $6,000 for that computer. I think I told you all before she paid $5,000, and I went back and I asked her. She's like, no, it was $6,000. It was an IBM. It ran on these large things that were actually called floppy disks. Most of you have never even seen them. And they used to keep calling them floppy disks after they were not floppy anymore. They became smaller and they were hard. But these were actually large things. They were fairly delicate. If you got them near a magnet or anything like that, you could ruin the disk. And they were expensive, and you put them in. And then you had to, in order to use the computer, you had to know DOS. You had to know how to actually go in and sort of code a little bit in order to get the computer to do what you want. How many of you actually know any code? One person. How many of you have taken an MIS class so far? A couple of you. Did you not have to code at all? There. You know, you had to actually know how to code. What do you do now with a computer?
Interface with the graphics.
Yeah, you click the start button and you start moving the mouse around the screen and find what you want. It's fairly user-friendly compared to what it was. If we'd had the similar technological advances in automobiles, we should have seen huge decreases in gas mileage. And it wasn't until we started having an oil crisis and the government began to mandate it that we started to get more fuel-efficient cars. When gas in the 1990s was still relatively cheap, who cared about paying for gas-guzzling cars like Ford F-150s? But what's happened now as a result of government mandates and the realization that we don't want to pay $5 a gallon in gas? What's happened to Ford? What have they done technologically to make it a better product?
They made them aluminum.
What?
They made them aluminum.
They made them aluminum, which has increased the price a lot. From 2014 to 2015 models, I think the price increase was almost 50% because of the aluminum. What else have they done in terms of the engines? What? The EcoBoost. Yeah, they've lowered the number of cylinders that you have to have to get the same number of torque, the same amount of torque, horsepower, and towing capacity by turbocharging the engines. And so they've changed the product as a result of government regulation and consumer demand. Where else did these ideas come from? Where else? What about your own employees? And particularly what types of employees who are out there every day interfacing with consumers? Which employees are the ones that have the most rich contact with consumers on a daily basis? Your what? maybe customer service, how about your sales force? They're actually out there listening to the customer. So ideas can come from them, right? These are all important sources of information. You should know for the exam why do products will fail. Again, going back to why is it that Coke has come up with all of these different things? Are all of them popular? A lot of them have been not great marketing successes. Let's look at some of these that are probably not great success stories. How many of you have tried? I have no idea what Vegevita is. How many of you have tried Diet Fused Tea? Okay. What about Delaware Punch? No? A lot of these are not, not big success stories. What is a big success story as the market has changed? Evian? Dasani? Where do you see it?
Right about this time.
Yeah, I think they do have some food products. Pepsi, for example, at one point in time bought all of, Long John Silver's KFC and what else? A&W Root Beer. They own all of those. And then who controlled Pepsi at one point in time? Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints was the largest shareholder of Pepsi. That's why. Again, this is where new product ideas come from. That's why the Mormon Church went from saying no caffeine to saying it was okay to drink caffeine because they bought Pepsi. It's amazing how you can have a theological shift based on things like that. So these new product ideas, why might they not come to fruition? Well, is there a big enough difference between Dasani, for example, and Evian? Really? No real differentiation. Is there a bigger difference between Evian and what are some of the other bottled water brands?
Smart. Make smart.
Okay. What about, what's Pepsi's brand of water? Yeah, I mean, is there a big enough differentiation between them? There's a big differentiation between Coke and Pepsi, isn't there? But in bottled water, is the bottled water industry even regulated, really? What can they do? Where can they get the water? From the tap, right? Bad timing, poor execution of the marketing mix, branding names, packaging, price, promotion. This failure to engage in segmentation effectively, understanding the segments, then targeting them and positioning. And again, when we talk about integrated marketing communication, advertising, and promotion, these are all going to be important things that you should consider. Research and development is another area that's rich for developing new products. How do you do that? What does 3M do? What's one of 3M's most successful products? And they didn't think it would be a success to begin with.
Post-it notes.
Post-it notes. Post-it notepads. They allow their researchers to just engage in projects that sort of interest them. And so 3M is known for all kinds of adhesives, tape, glues, things like that. How many of you had braces when you were in high school? A goodly number of you. Any of you have Light Cure braces? Nobody had a Light Cure brace? That's the brace, the bracket that they put on. And it was, when I was getting braces years and years and years ago, it took a long time for the epoxy to set on your tooth, and they would have to hold it there. 3M came out with this thing where they put the epoxy on, pop the bracket on, shine an ultraviolet light on the bracket, and it cures almost instantly. That was a 3M development. They had a researcher who was working on epoxies and glues and adhesives. And he found one that it wasn't terribly wet. It wasn't terribly sticky. But if you put two pieces of paper together, unlike traditional glues, what could you do with them? You could pull them apart without tearing the paper. And they became a huge success. So they got this idea from research and development. From a marketing, maybe failure, to a huge success story that now allows them to do what? Post-its come not just in the yellow little sticky packet, but what else? All kinds of colors, flags. They put them in pens so that as you're taking notes in class, you can highlight and flag your book, right? What are some other things that research and development have led to? Just by accident. How many of you have heard of a drug called Propecia? What was Propecia originally marketed for? Men with enlarged prostates. They started testing it, giving it to men who had enlarged prostates, and they noticed that it did what? Regrew hair. So it's now marketed more as a what? Hair growth drug than as a prostate drug.
Viagra was also originally marketed to help with baking in China. And then it didn't really work that well, but the people who were in the study came back and were like, you still have some, even though you're not,
Yeah,
in the study.
a lot of these things that might be market failures actually turn into, from research and development, into marketing successes. You should understand about the stages of bringing products to market, where from development, idea generation, things like that, through testing, and what kinds of things you can test. There are certain types of products that can't be tested. What kinds of things do you think you can't or are difficult to test? How about services? Why would services sometimes be difficult to test? What?
Because if someone's getting a service for free, it's difficult to gauge whether or not they're actually getting a service and offer.
It's also difficult to gauge from one person to the next because the data is so qualitatively rich to determine whether what you may like, somebody else may not. And then it becomes very difficult to standardize that because we're going from one customer to the next. And what you may, how many of you like to go to Massage Envy? Nobody goes to Massage Envy? What are the different types of massage that you can get? Hot stone massage, Swedish massage, deep tissue massage. And all of those different types of services appeal to different types of people. And so it's very difficult to standardize those. So understand that. All right, if you want to, let me put this table over here so that I can go through the exam. If you want to put your devices up here, and I'll try to stand still. I know I pace a lot so that you can get good quality recording. Yep. We'll just watch the film. All right. It's always good to have a backup sometimes the film fails. It failed on Tuesday. I got over to my office and it did not fail. I don't know what happened. Between the technologically sophisticated remote control device, i.e. my iPhone, and the camera, something happened. Consumer behavior, the definition of consumer behavior. and the stages that the text talks about in the consumer decision-making process and what each of those stages are in sequence. And what I called that process, which is rational actor, the rational actor model. And I suggested to you that maybe that model doesn't really work very well with regard to a lot of purchases, because maybe we're not really all that rational of an actor. I also suggested to you that you could have low-level rationality and what that entails, what low-level rationality entails. So there are about 3 questions at least that ask you, like, for example, the third stage of the consumer decision-making model, rational actor model, what is what. You should be able to, at each of those stages, identify what's happening substantively. So there's a question, for example, that asks about a hypothetical situation and what stage that would be at. The text talks about differences between an ideal and an actual situation and what happens when that occurs. If you do engage in the rational decision-making process in terms of information search, how can you go about that? What's one source of information? What's your first source of information, probably? Probably your brain, right? Your evoked set. The text talks about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and this idea that needs at certain levels have to be satisfied before you can go to the next level. So for example, in terms of marketing, if people are hungry and don't have shelter, are they going to be interested in purchasing things like what? iPhones? Probably not. What's next on the needs? Safety. And at least at those lower levels, I suggested to you that this makes sense. You might risk your personal safety if you're starving to death. If your children are starving, you might do what? You might engage in theft, which in Oklahoma is a highly risky activity, considering that everybody has a gun, right? We all are packing. How many of you have a concealed carry permit? This is Oklahoma. Were most of you not raised here? I have a concealed carry permit. How many of you support concealed carry on campus? Wow. Okay. It might make my lectures more entertaining. You need to understand the difference between perception, values, motivation, personality. You need to understand comprehension and retention. Selective retention. We talked about organizational buying behavior and how it differs. It may be more rational than consumer decision making because organizational behavior is based on what? Your own purchasing decisions are often based on your own personal needs or a very small set of people in terms of needs, but organizations base their buying decision off of what kind of demand. You should know what the North American Industrial Classification System is. and what it allows between the countries of NAFTA. What are the countries of the North American Free Trade Agreement? Okay. It uses a 6-digit coding system, and there are 1, 2, 3 questions that ask you specifically what, for example, the first 2 digits designate, what the 5th digit designates, a comparison again between organizational buying and consumer. It asks you to evaluate several statements and pick the one that's most accurate. In thinking about these, and in the second exam, some of the questions, more so than even in the first exam, some of the questions in the first exam asked you for the most accurate statement. So you have to remember that statements may be true, but if another statement is more true because it contains an element that increases the amount of accuracy of the statement, that's the statement that you should select. I have not chosen any that ask you, like they asked on the Oklahoma bar exam, about which is the worst, because I think those are really hard to determine, but apparently the bar thinks that they can. They ask you all these questions, like, which is the worst offense for your criminal defendant? He's going to jail. How do you determine? You know, going to jail for long periods of time, they're all equally bad. I don't do that. But I do ask you for a number of them that have the most, or the best answer. So think about that. Buying centers and what buying centers entail in the decision-making process. So what kinds of factors are going to be important in understanding organizational buying centers? Generally, there are what? Increased numbers of participants that are involved in the decision-making process. There can be more formalized. Because you have increased number of participants, more formalization, what does that do to the buying time for organizations? It takes a lot longer to sell to organizations than it does to sell to individuals. What is the primary organizational buying objective? In developing relationships with businesses in organizational selling, what kinds of things are going to be critical? What is the role of professional selling that's going to take place in that context? Your text talks about a number of practices that can occur in organizational buying and selling. So things like supply contracts, output contracts, are things that you should know about. Reciprocity. Exclusive territories, things like that are important. Within the buying center, people who exert influence do what? Then on Thursday, Dr. Morale talked about globalization. Some of the things that you should have picked up from that, from the text. Which is the largest exporter in the world? What's the largest importer? Those are two questions. Which is the leading exporter? Which is the leading importer? How important is globalization? What are the ways that you can engage in global trade? What's the easiest of those methods? Which involve the highest levels of risk? What kinds of things do you need to understand in terms of a global environmental scan? Things like choice of forum and choice of law clauses, these are talked about in your text, can become very important in global trade, particularly when contracts go wrong. Choice of forum determines where you will settle a dispute should it arise. Choice of law determines what law will apply. Choice of language, can that impact contractual negotiations? And why? Why would choice of language impact it?
Unless you're bilingual, then someone's going to understand your other business.
Well, even if you're bilingual, you can still have misunderstandings. For example, in French, the word for bad can also mean, in a very ordinary sense, can also mean evil. If you have a headache, the French say, "Je mal à la tête." That doesn't mean I have evil in my head. It means I have, but the translation and the back translation can create problems and these kinds of things. And so these choice of language, choice of form, choice of law clauses can be critical. You should know the definitions from the text of segmenting, how it's done, targeting, and positioning. Understand market differentiation. I went to a conference in which one of the presenters said, differentiation is the most important word in marketing today. Differentiation. As discussed in class, you should know what mass customization is and what's an alternative term for mass customization. The text talks about steps in segmenting and the way that you can segment. And I asked you the other day, what's the easiest way? The easiest way to segment is to use, for example, perhaps census data. It gives you a lot. And I use the example of Edmond. What do we know about Edmond? It's a large income producer. The average income producer, the average household income in Edmond is greater than anywhere else in the state of Oklahoma. What does that mean? Well, is that as useful as maybe other types of ways that we can segment? If you look at it, the text talks about the vowels system. You should actually maybe take the vowels survey. Have any of you taken that? The vowels survey, which tells you what kind of buyer you are. Those are called psychographic characteristics. That may be more beneficial. Understanding differences in geographic segmentation. For example, when I got my PhD in New Mexico, at New Mexico State, in Las Cruces, what's the climate like down there? It is far south of us. It's hot and dry. It's in the middle of the desert, right on the border. They asked school children in the Las Cruces school system where they were most likely to see a boat. What do you think they said? No, the highway. They were most likely to see a boat on the highway. Why is that? That people are driving their boats, across country, and that's where they saw them. They don't have what? The Rio Grande is actually not that grand anymore as a result of it being dammed up. So you don't see a lot of boats. If you ask children in Oklahoma where the most likely places to see a boat are, they're probably going to say what? A lake. If you ask them, you know, in Tupelo, Mississippi, what are they going to say? The Mississippi River. So understanding things like that, the geographic segmentation and differences that can occur. You need to know the definition of product in the 4 Ps and the broad expanse that can take. The different types of products the text talks about. So for example, consumer products, business products, convenience products, and unsought products. What's an example? I didn't talk about this today in terms of new product development. What's an unsought product? Well, you generally seek out things like what? Food, clothing. What don't you generally think about? A funeral. Some people do. In the past, people were more interested in planning. That's generally an unsought product. You don't think about funeral services until what? Until somebody's dead. You don't think about towing services until your car's broken down on the side of the road. How many of you follow your tow truck company? Like their webpage, things like that. Those are unsought products. You should understand pricing of products. Generally, we'll talk more about pricing. Which, we'll talk more about distribution, but there is one question in terms of an example that's given in the text on distribution, how things like consumer products are distributed. And then there are 2 free questions on the exam. All right, so for a week from today, your assignment for your groups is to come up with the 3 things that you think are going to be the most important developments in marketing in terms of products or services. You can come up with broad categories, and then you need to justify those decisions in your group. So provide some kind of justification. That will provide you with instantly after the exam on Tuesday the opportunity to win bonus points, which I'm sure you'll want, because in reviewing the second exam from last semester, the average grade on that exam was a 57. So